today's mindful moment, packed with insights but designed to fit into your busy life. One deep dive at a time. We always talk about history in terms of big personalities,
Right.
Decisive battles, those sorts of things, the grand narratives that end up in textbooks.
Right.
But I was thinking, have we ever really considered that the real turning points, those moments that actually steer the course of civilization,
Yeah.
maybe they are triggered by something way smaller, something almost invisible.
That's an interesting thought, yeah. Like what could possibly be smaller than a general leading an army into battle or an emperor issuing a decree?
Right, exactly. Like what about like a tiny organism, something you can't even see with the naked eye? Yeah. Could that have reshaped the world we live in today?
I mean, that is a pretty compelling idea. It kind of makes you rethink how we understand historical change, right? It moves beyond, history just being like the product of what humans want and do. And it opens up the possibility that there are these deeper, more complex forces that are actually at play.
Yeah, for sure. So on this deep dive, we're going to journey back to the 6th century to explore just such an invisible force,
Okay.
the Justinianic plague,
Wow.
and its transformative impact. And for this exploration, we're going to be using William Rosen's incredibly well-researched book, Justinian's Flea,
Yep.
Plague, Empire, and the Birth of Europe.
I love that title.
Yeah, it's catchy, right?
It really is.
So as you kind of get into Rosen's book, you see how this pandemic wasn't just like a time of immense suffering.
Right.
It actually acted as like a hinge, a real hinge that contributed in profound ways
Yeah.
to the shift from the late Roman Empire to what we now know as medieval Europe.
Yeah, and what makes Rosen's analysis so insightful, I think, is the way he connects the biological reality of the plague with the societal, political, and economic consequences.
Right.
Like it's not just about counting the dead, which is obviously horrific. Those numbers are staggering.
Yeah.
But it's about understanding how this biological shockwave rippled through all these existing structures and in a way helped to give birth to a new era.
Totally.
And that's what we're going to try to unpack today, see how this microscopic event had such a macroscopic impact.
Exactly. So to get started, we're going to first paint a picture of the 6th century Mediterranean world just before this flea arrived.
Okay.
Right. And then from there, we're going to trace the path of the bacterium itself, understand its immediate and devastating effects. And then finally, we'll examine those long-term and oftentimes surprising consequences that played a huge role in shaping the Europe that would eventually emerge. So
That's like a plan.
what was that world like right before everything changed?
Well, imagine a world connected by these sea lanes, a vibrant network of trade crisscrossing the Mediterranean. Alexandria was a crucial node in this system, this bustling port linking east and west. Ships were constantly arriving and departing, carrying essential goods like grain valuable resources like copper and luxury items like silk. But you know what else? These vital arteries of commerce also unknowingly facilitated the movement of something far more sinister.
I see. So this interconnectedness, this trade network, while it was great for prosperity and cultural exchange, also inadvertently created like a perfect highway for the spread of disease.
Exactly.
Wow. So at the heart of all of this, we have Emperor Justinian,
Right.
a figure driven by this almost like fanatical ambition to restore the Roman Empire to its former glory.
I mean, this guy was a force of nature. He initiated sweeping legal reforms that would resonate for centuries,
Yeah.
He embarked on massive building projects, and most famously the Hagia Sophia.
Absolutely.
Rosen even kind of hints at his almost obsessive work ethic. Those late night sessions that fueled all these rumors about his true nature.
Yeah, it's interesting when you think about Justinian's grand vision and then the context in which it's all unfolding, right? Because
Absolutely.
the old Roman Empire had long been divided, with the center of power really shifting eastward to Constantinople. And then on the fringes,
Right.
you have these new groups asserting themselves.
Yeah, like her.
The Visigoths and Ostrogoths, the Franks, carving out their own territory.
Right.
And, centuries before, figures like Diocletian and Constantine, they had already set these profound changes in motion. And Justinian is operating within this evolving landscape.
So it's a very complex situation.
Right. And you can't really talk about Justinian without acknowledging the immense influence of Empress Theodora.
Of course not.
Rosen makes it so clear that she was way more than just a consort,
She was a remarkable woman.
Her intelligence, her strong will, and her decisive actions made her such a crucial partner in Justinian's ambitious reign.
Yeah, you really get the sense that she was a major power player in her own right.
Or absolutely.
Yeah.
So internally, you have this dynamic unfolding, and then externally, the empire wasn't just focused inward.
Right.
There were these significant external pressures too, primarily the ongoing, often very tense relationship with the Persian Empire under Khusro.
Yes, they had achieved like a fragile peace, you know,
Yeah.
but it was always this potential source of conflict.
Right. So it was a dynamic world, but also kind of precarious, seemingly on the verge of further transformation even before this unseen enemy came into the picture.
Absolutely. A world ripe for disruption, you could say.
Okay, so you have this vast interconnected empire with all these moving parts, ambitious rulers, these emerging kingdoms, these underlying tensions, and then bam, this microscopic bacterium.
Yeah.
Yersinia pestis
Oh, boy.
makes its dramatic entrance.
Right.
How did that happen?
Well, the arrival of Yersinia pestis really does mark this like pivotal moment, and to understand its impact, you have to look at its natural cycle, you know?
Yeah.
So the bacterium primarily lives in rodents, and specifically the black rat, Rattus, likely traveled from its origins in India via those very trade ships that connected the East and the West.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, you could say it was like an unintended consequence of global trade, even way back then in the 6th century.
So even back then, globalization was already a thing.
In a way, yeah.
That's wild. So these black rats, they arrive in the Mediterranean and
Yeah. Well, they found ideal breeding grounds in these densely populated cities.
makes sense.
But the real vector, the one that actually transmitted the disease to humans, was a specific flea species, Xenopsilochiopus.
And this flea was particularly good at spreading the plague because
This flea, it was perfectly adapted to living on rats and occasionally biting humans. So it became this unwitting agent of devastation.
Wow. And so what was it about this flea Xenopsilochiopus that made it so efficient at transmitting the bacteria?
So here's the thing. The flea would ingest the Yersinia pestis when it bit an infected rat.
Right.
But then the bacteria would actually form this biofilm, this kind of sticky mass. And that would block the flea's proventriculus. It's part of its digestive system. And this blockage meant that the flea couldn't really feed properly, so it's constantly hungry.
Oh, no.
And it would just bite more frequently.
Oh, gosh.
And each time it bit, it would regurgitate the bacteria into the wound, infecting its new host. It's like this truly unfortunate biological chain of events. It's like the perfect storm for spreading a plague.
Right.
So Rosen lays out this chilling timeline for the plague's spread. Where does it all begin?
So it appears that the plague first popped up around 540 CE in Pelusium in Egypt.
Okay.
From that initial foothold, it just spread so rapidly along those established trade routes,
Yeah.
reaching the capital Constantinople in the spring of 542.
Oh, wow.
And the sheer scale of death in Constantinople, I mean, it's almost impossible to grasp. Accounts suggest something like 5,000 people dying every single day at the peak of the outbreak.
5,000 a day.
Yeah, can you imagine the chaos and the fear that must have gripped the city?
That's unimaginable. I mean, what did it look like? What did people experience?
Well, I mean, it's really difficult for us to even fathom that level of mortality in a major urban center.
Yeah.
You know, just think about the logistics of trying to deal with that many bodies, the breakdown of social order, just the sheer psychological trauma inflicted on the survivors.
Right.
It would have been a city completely overwhelmed. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So we have these accounts from historians who were living through this, like Procopius and Evagrius Scholasticus. What are they saying?
Well, their descriptions of the symptoms are pretty terrifying.
Like what?
You know, it started with this sudden onset of fever and chills, excruciating headaches and body aches.
Oh, my God.
And then those characteristic buboes would develop the swollen and often separating lymph nodes in the groin, the armpits, and the neck.
That sounds awful.
It was truly horrific.
So Procopius gives us this kind of clinical account, right?
Right.
But then you have John of Ephesus.
Right.
His perspective is a little bit different.
Yeah, well, John of Ephesus, he was a monophysite Christian. And his viewpoint really added this powerful, almost apocalyptic dimension to his descriptions of the suffering. So for him, this immense suffering, this was like divine judgment or something.
It's possible, yeah. Or maybe he saw it as part of this larger cosmic struggle.
And this perspective, I think it really imbues his writing with this intense and personal quality. You know, it makes the horror of the plague even more palpable.
Wow. So regardless of how they interpreted it, both Procopius and John of Ephesus really convey the sheer agony and this widespread death that was happening all around them.
Yeah, they don't hold back.
And on top of everything else, there are even reports of neurological symptoms.
Oh, yeah, like what?
delirium coma, slurred speech.
Right.
And this kind of suggests that the infection was attacking the whole body.
Right, absolutely. It was a systemic infection.
Okay, so you have this highly lethal disease. It's spreading rapidly through a very dense population, and there's no effective means of prevention or cure.
Yeah.
This is starting to sound very familiar.
Yeah, and I think that's what makes studying these historical pandemics both fascinating and terrifying, because there are these echoes of our own experiences.
Right, and as we know from Rosen, at this time, they had no concept of germ theory, so how are they trying to treat this?
Well, they're trying everything they can think of, but without understanding the root cause, it's all really just guesswork.
So, like, what were they doing?
Well, Rosen describes some of the measures that people took, like desperate measures, things like cold baths, applying various herbs, even trying to get divine intervention through relics and amulets. But, without that understanding of how germs work, these efforts were mostly pointless.
Of course, yeah.
And in some cases, those contemporary medical practices, that involved using potentially toxic substances might have actually made things worse.
Oh.
So essentially, they were facing this invisible enemy, and they had absolutely no real weapons to fight it with.
That's so frightening. So the immediate impact in Constantinople was clearly devastating.
Absolutely.
With these mass graves and this breakdown of civic life. But, as Rosen argues, it was actually the long-term demographic shifts across the Mediterranean that really remade Europe right.
Yeah. I mean, the plague triggered this significant and sustained population decline, not only within the Byzantine Empire, but also in those newly emerging Islamic territories and the Frankish kingdoms as well.
Wow.
It was this shock to the whole system.
So is it just this massive die-off across the board? Or is there something more nuanced going on?
Well, that's what's so interesting. Rosen points out some very specific demographic effects.
Okay, like what?
For example, it seems that the mortality rate among very young children was actually lower compared to adults.
Huh. That's surprising. Why would that be?
Well, one possible explanation is that their smaller size meant they were less likely to be bitten by those infected fleas.
That makes sense.
On the other hand, monasteries, which were often, very densely populated and had close contact between people,
Right.
it seems like they had these disproportionately high mortality rates.
Wow, so the plague was really reshaping the population in these unexpected ways.
Yes, and the impact on the agricultural base across Western Europe was particularly severe. Well, with such a massive reduction in the workforce, there were labor shortages, food production was disrupted, and this led to long-lasting economic and social instability.
So it's like a ripple effect, right?
Exactly.
Starts with this disease, but it ends up transforming every aspect of life.
Right.
But then there's this interesting twist in this story.
Oh, what's that?
So while the Mediterranean world was struggling with this demographic disaster, Rosen points out that there was actually a population expansion happening in the more peripheral regions of Western Europe.
Like where?
Like places like Britain, the Rhine, Scandinavia, and this is happening in the centuries following the plague.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, and he even suggests that there might have been this kind of under-the-radar agricultural revolution going on in these areas that helped to fuel this resurgence.
Interesting. So you see this uneven impact of the plague actually leading to some unexpected outcomes.
Right, so in the Mediterranean you have depopulation and instability. But in these more northern regions, the labor shortages might have actually spurred innovation and changes in agricultural practices.
Which in turn could have led to more productivity and the ability to support a larger population.
Right, so it's like this really complex interplay of factors.
Exactly.
A devastating event like the plague can have these unforeseen and even positive consequences in the long run, but obviously not for the millions who died.
That's the tragedy of it all.
Yeah, absolutely. And the impact wasn't even uniform globally, was it?
No, not at all.
Rosen notes that China, even though they had these extensive trade networks, it seems like they didn't get hit nearly as hard by this pandemic.
And why do you think that was?
Well, he suggests it might be because the main trade routes with the West were focused on silk rather than bulk goods like grain.
Okay.
Which would have been more likely to have rats, along those long overland and sea journeys.
Right. So the nature of the trade itself could have played a role in limiting the spread of the plague.
Exactly. And then you also have Arabia, which it seems like they were relatively spared as well.
Interesting.
Yeah, and that might be due to a combination of factors like their climate, the lower population density compared to the urban centers of the Mediterranean, and their different patterns of trade.
So it's a reminder that geography and environment can also be really significant factors in how a pandemic plays out.
Okay, so we've been talking a lot about the big picture impact of the plague, but let's bring it back to the Byzantine Empire for a moment.
Okay.
How did the Justinianic plague affect their ambitions?
Well, it's important to remember that Justinian had poured so many resources into his efforts to reconquer those territories that the Western Roman Empire had lost, especially in Italy.
Mm.
But the plague really just wiped out a huge chunk of the empire's manpower and financial reserves.
Right. So even though they had these military successes, the plague kind of undermined their long-term ability to hold on to those gains.
Exactly. And Rosen highlights figures like Narses, who were able to essentially undo a lot of the Byzantine gains in Italy later on.
Yeah.
Suggesting that there's this direct connection between the weakening effect of the plague and these geopolitical shifts.
Wow, it's amazing to think how this seemingly isolated biological event could have such ripple effects across different aspects of life,
Absolutely.
from demographics to economics to the balance of power between empires.
And it really makes you realize that history isn't just about, the actions of these great leaders or these big battles. Sometimes it's the smallest, most unexpected things that can have the biggest impact.
Right. It kind of makes you wonder how many other seemingly insignificant events have actually shaped the course of history in ways we might not even realize.
And that brings up an interesting point. This deep dive we've been doing into this pivotal historical event, looking at the causes and all of its far-reaching consequences, it really highlights how important it is to get a deeper understanding.
Yeah.
And to do that, we have to piece together information from all these different sources and consider different perspectives.
Yep.
So if you're interested in exploring complex topics through in-depth analysis, like we've been doing here, you might find Mindful Moments on YouTube really interesting.
Oh, yeah. What's that?
So it's an AI audiobook analysis channel, and they basically take these really dense and important books, and they extract the key ideas in a way that makes them super accessible and engaging.
Oh, wow. So it's like another way to think critically and process information.
Exactly.
That sounds cool.
Yeah.
Okay, so back to the plague. We've seen how it triggered these massive shifts in population and power. But how did this all ultimately contribute to the formation of this distinct Europe as we understand it today?
Well, Rosen argues that the weakening of that central imperial authority in the West, combined with the demographic and economic upheaval caused by the plague, it created this power vacuum.
Interesting.
And this vacuum essentially allowed distinct regional powers to consolidate their control.
Okay, so can you give me an example?
Sure, think about the Frankish kingdoms. They were in a prime position to benefit from this situation, the Frankish kings, through forging these alliances with the Gallo-Roman bishops. It was like this confessional alliance.
Right.
And they really laid the foundation for this distinct Frankish identity, separate from that lingering Roman imperial identity.
And that was really important because...
Well, it wasn't just a religious alignment, right?
What?
It was about building this shared cultural and political identity within this specific geographical area.
Okay, so this regional consolidation that's happening, it's being facilitated in part by the weakening of these larger imperial structures due to the plague.
Yeah.
And that becomes like a key element in the emergence of these distinct European polities.
Exactly.
That's fascinating. And Rosen also draws this really interesting contrast with China, doesn't he?
He does.
So while Europe is fragmenting into these various kingdoms and eventually nations, China, despite experiencing its own periods of internal strife, they largely maintain their overall cultural and political coherence.
Right. And it's interesting to consider how the different impacts of the plague, among other factors, might have contributed to these very divergent long-term trajectories.
Wow. Yeah, these two major world regions, and they're kind of set on these different paths.
Yeah, it's a really powerful illustration of how something like this, a seemingly localized biological event, can have truly global and long-lasting consequences.
Absolutely. And it's not just about the political landscape either, is it?
No, what else?
I mean, even Justinian's own legal code, the Corpus Juris Civilis, which was later rediscovered in the West, it also played this kind of indirect role in the development of European nation-states.
In what way?
Well, it provided a framework for centralized legal authority.
Oh, I see.
So even though that wasn't its immediate impact in the 6th century, it ended up shaping the way that law and governance evolved in Europe over the long term.
So we've covered a lot of ground here today. And as we wrap up this deep dive, it's really quite remarkable to reflect on the influence of this, seemingly isolated biological event.
Right.
The Justinianic plague. It wasn't just a devastating pandemic. It acted as this major catalyst. It altered the course of history and played this significant role in shaping the world that followed.
It's amazing to think about all of the different ways that it reshaped societies, economies, and the map of Europe.
Yeah, and to think that all of this was set in motion by this tiny flea.
Right, just like the title of Rosen's book suggests.
Exactly. It really highlights how history is not always driven by, these big pronouncements of emperors or these clashes of armies. Sometimes the smallest, most unexpected agents can have the most transformative effects.
Yeah, it makes you wonder how many other seemingly insignificant events have actually shaped the course of history in ways we might not even realize.
That's a question worth pondering. What other historical moments might benefit from a similar deep dive?
Mm.
Looking beyond those traditional narratives to uncover the influence of those less obvious factors.
Exactly. And if you've enjoyed this deep dive into the Justinianic plague,
I know I have.
we would love for you to subscribe to the deep dive for more in-depth discussions of these transformative historical events.
Yes, and if you found this episode particularly thought-provoking, please share it with anyone else who might appreciate it.
Absolutely. And for those of you who want to dive even deeper into this fascinating period, we highly recommend checking out William Rosen's Justinian's Flea. You can find a link in the show notes.
And remember, folks,
Yeah,
always approach information with a critical and inquisitive mind.
absolutely. Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
We'll see you next time.